statement. He said it's the best thing that ever happened. And his name was St. Augustine. Now you can buy his books on the railway bookstall today, and if I tell you some of the things this great man said, you'd recognize them. He said, "Our hearts are restless, and they can find no rest until they find their rest in thee." I suppose the most quoted prayer of history. It was Augustine who prayed, "Give me chastity, but not just yet." A prayer which ought to have been repeated in history. It was Augustine who said, "Love and do what you like." That's another of his famous sayings. But let me tell you a little about him. He's had more influence on church history than any other man after the Apostle Paul. He was born in North Africa, and when he went as a student to the University of Carthage, he got into the wrong crowd of young men, and he pretty soon had a concubine by whom he had a son. He lived in an illegal relationship with her for some 20 years. He had a pagan father, but a very godly and saintly mother, who prayed for him with tears every day, and prayed for this wayward son of hers, Augustine. Later, because of his brilliant mind and academic career, he was invited to be a professor of rhetoric in Milan University. And when he went there, he went to hear the saintly Bishop Ambrose, whose hymn you sang at the beginning of this service, and whose mortal remains I've looked upon. And under the preaching of that bishop, this young man Augustine, with his brilliant mind, but with his thoroughly profligate living, was brought into a tremendous conviction of uncertainty and sin. And one day, sitting in a garden, weeping over the mess he'd made of his life, he heard a child's voice, a boy's voice over the garden wall saying, "Tolly leggy, take up and read." He never knew who that boy was, but he noticed a scroll on the seat by him, and he took it up and read it, and it was Romans. It was Paul's letter to the Romans, and Augustine read it through, and the light dawned. When he walked out in the street afterwards, the woman he'd lived with saw him, and he ran away from her. And she ran after him and said, "Augustine, it is I, it is I." And he replied, shouting over his shoulder, "But it is not I. It is not I." Gradually he got his life straightened out, and he began to write. And he's written down the whole story of his conversion in a book called Confessions. The Confessions of St. Augustine, and I saw it on the local railway bookstore just a week or two back. You can buy it and read it. This great man. Now, when he was in his middle age, Rome fell, and the whole world seemed to collapse about his ears. And Augustine went to thinking about this, and finally he wrote a second book. He wrote many, but the second great book which we remember is called City of God. And in it he says this: it's a good thing that this pagan city of Rome has collapsed, because now the city of God can replace it. It's a good thing that an earthly empire has come to end, because the heavenly empire can now be established. And this was his book, and it brought hope and new life to many people. It brought them to see that there was a city of God that still survived when the city of men had gone. Now I'm afraid that was the trouble, because people began to say, now what is this city of God? Is it a visible thing or an invisible thing? Is it an earthly or a heavenly? And I'm afraid at this point Augustine led many people into a misunderstanding through this second book. And the funny thing is that centuries later in the Reformation, the Protestants said we follow Augustine, and the Roman Catholics said we follow Augustine. But the Protestants were following his first book, Confessions, and the Roman Catholics were following his second book, City of God. For this is what happened. The church said, well, if that's the truth, then the church is now the new empire. And one of the first results of this was the rise of the Roman bishop to the position of emperor. Now, in those days, there was a great debate about the word pope. It means essentially father. And in spite of the fact that Jesus had said, don't ever call anyone on earth father, you have one Father in heaven. In spite of that, they began to call the local priest father, then they called the regional bishops father, And then finally the 5 great bishops of Jerusalem, Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome, and one other which I've forgotten, Carthage was it, they began to say, now look, if you're going to call anybody father, it ought to be us 5. And finally the Bishop of Rome said, now look, the city of Rome's gone, but I'm the emperor now. I'm the chief bishop, and from now on you only call me Pope. You only call me father. And the papacy, as we know it, came into being. And the interesting thing is that the Pope adopted the titles and even the robes of the Roman emperor. He adopted the title Pontifex Maximus, otherwise known today as the Pontiff. And it's the Roman emperor's title. And you see, Augustine's idea was mistaken, and people thought the church is the new empire, and it must have its emperor, and it must have its robes, it must have its ceremonies, it must have its throne. And so the church became an empire, and the Pope became a king. Now, of course, you would imagine that many Christians were having none of that. The French Christians wouldn't have it. The Irish Christians wouldn't have it, the Welsh Christians wouldn't have it, and the Scottish Christians wouldn't have it. I'm afraid the English Christians did. And at one time it looked as if the British Isles would be caught between those who believed Christianity didn't have a pope and those who believed it did. You see, Ireland, through St. Columba, went into Iona and into Scotland and led Scotland to Christ. And then down came Aidan to the island of Lindisfarne off Northumberland. And about 2 months ago I was standing on the island of Lindisfarne at the ruins of Aidan's